morning, everyone. Hi. It's nice to see so many faces here. Thank you for joining us. My name is Tima Nwana, and I will be the moderator of today's panel. So today's panel is focused on the regulation and governance of AI systems, specifically looking at health innovation and research. With the recent increase of legislative activity in this area, we're left with several questions, right? Like questions including effective implementation and interpretation, and what exactly is going to be the interplay between new legislative initiatives and existing EU regulations. So don't worry, our panelists here today are here to answer all of these questions and offer some more insight on the question of AI governance and regulation, looking specifically at health innovation and research. Before we kick things off, I would like to give a quick little shout out to our organizers. Today's panel is organized by the University of Vienna, specifically the Department of Innovation and Digitalisation in Law. The ID Law Department is the first of its kind at the university, and it really focuses on questions of modern media, information society, and all things to do with the implications of developments in technology and innovation. The department is involved with a lot of EU-funded technology projects where we give insights and conduct research on questions of data protection, privacy, and all things to do with compliance in the research space. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce our first panelist, Richard Rack. Richard is a doctoral researcher at the University of Bologna, University of Vienna, and the University of Turin. He is currently a research fellow at the University of Milan and a privacy specialist intern at Doc Planner Group. His research focuses on privacy, data protection, and AI governance challenges, looking specifically at IoT-enabled and AI-supported telehealth systems. So, Richard, take it away.
Thank you, Tima, and good morning, everybody. It's nice to have you here. First of all, I would like to talk about the regulatory aspects of Internet of Health things and interconnected AI systems under EU law. And in particular, I would like to explore the question of what are the possible implications of the draft AI Act for the innovation of Internet of Health things, devices, and interconnected AI systems. So when we talk about Internet of Health things, we are talking about sensors that are connected to the internet and are enabled by embodied computing, body-centric computing, in other words. These may take on various forms, such as a wearable smartwatch that can detect COVID of the user, for instance, a smart bionic arm, or an embeddable smart tattoo placed on the human skin that can show blood sugar levels, or an ingestible smart pill. And there are also non-invasive methods such as a smart health mirror. The benefits of these solutions is that they bring healthcare services outside from the clinical context to telehealth environments, and they provide more personalized healthcare services and also real-time health monitoring solutions. So why do we need to talk about AI in this regard? It's because these Internet of Health things physical devices collect large amounts of raw data, and these, in combination with data collected from combined with other data sources, need to be processed by the use of data science methods and in particular AI systems in order to transform these raw big data into actionable smart data that can bring benefits and support this, benefits to the individual's health and support medical decision-making. And ultimately, these can improve healthcare services and make healthcare systems more resilient. From a computing perspective, in the past years, AI systems were physically non-embedded, typically located supported by cloud or fog computing resources. However, with advancements in microprocessing technologies, AI systems have become, the possibility is now present to physically actually embed AI systems into Internet of Health things physical devices with the emerging era of artificial intelligence of things, or in other words, tiny machine learning techniques. From a legal point of view, the important aspect is that, fortunately, both the Medical Devices Regulation and the Draft AI Act specify that the physical location or interconnection of AI systems does not affect its legal qualification. This is important. Then if we move on to an overview of the safety, performance, and quality requirements of Internet of Health Things and connected AI systems, we can focus on three pieces of legislation. The General Product Safety Directive provides a lex generalis safety net for these legal requirements. This is under amendment at the moment. However, the legal problem with this is that this safety net has some gaps in it, and it does not, even with the regulation proposal now in the legislative procedure, it is not clear whether all digital products will actually fall into the safety net. Then if we look at the left side of the slide, if a product, a consumer health product reaches the threshold, satisfies the definition of a medical device under the Medical Devices Regulation, then it will, then the safety, performance, and quality requirements of the Medical Devices Regulation will be applicable. Later on, Elizabeth will talk more about the problem of the borderline between medical devices and consumer health products or wellness applications, as the new European Health Data Space Regulation proposal states this. On the right side, we see that if a software product meets the definition of an AI system, then it will fall under the AI Act proposal. And I will mention later on the connection between the Medical Devices Regulation and the AI Act proposal, which is problematic in many regards. If we, as I mentioned, under the Medical Devices Regulation, a medical device, the key factor is whether the Internet of Health Things physical device and the connected AI system has a medical purpose, and whether these have two independent medical purposes or whether they have one medical purpose. Accordingly, in the former case, they have to undergo two separate conformity assessment procedures. In the latter case, there's only one single conformity assessment procedure. Now, as I mentioned, the Draft AI Act, Article 6 of the Draft AI Act, specifies that standalone AI systems that are medium or high-risk medical devices, or AI systems intended to be used as a safety component of a medium or high-risk medical device, shall be considered high-risk AI systems under the Draft AI Act. However, the problem that many stakeholders in the healthcare industry have noted is that there's a significant misalignment and duplications between the Medical Devices Regulation and the Draft AI Act, which may lead to legal uncertainties. And in particular, when I say this, I refer to the different safety, performance, and quality requirements between the two pieces of legislation. This will imply that manufacturers of medical devices and providers of AI systems will have to perform two parallel technical documentations. They will have to set up two quality management systems. And also, it's not clear how they should apply these regulations or foreseen regulation, because there are different definitions of users, for example. In the Medical Devices Regulation, user means both a healthcare professional and a lay person. However, in the Draft AI Act, user typically means or refers to the healthcare service provider. There's also a different threshold for serious incidents under the two regulations. And a not fit for purpose AI definition. In one aspect, it's too narrow. In another aspect, it's too broad, even after the amendments in recent months. Then there's a different risk classification and the risk management requirements, different and limited number of notified bodies with limited competence in many cases, performing parallel conformity assessments, meaning it's a quite inefficient administrative system, and there's also parallel incident reporting. So as in conclusion, this over-regulation and legal uncertainties with respect to regulating AI in healthcare, this means that it may increase compliance costs due to the duplications. And if compliance costs increase, then that will usually mean that it will increase barriers to market entry for small and medium enterprises, AI startups in healthcare, which will stifle digital health innovation. And ultimately, it will deprive European patients, citizens of access to state-of-the-art digital health technologies, not just in AI, but as I've shown, AI is connected in many cases to Internet of Health things devices, so it will also have an effect on the IoT market. Thank you very much, and I will pass the word on to Martin now.
Thank you, Richard. Our next speaker is Martin Urban. Martin is a data governance manager at Boehringer Ingelheim, a leading pharmaceutical company.
Yeah, thank you. So coming from the Internet of Things and the devices into the clinical trial context, so how to use these devices in a clinical trial context, we have established processes in the companies, and especially also in the pharma companies, how to work with data. So, and these established processes are important in the time when this data should be utilized also for other purposes. And therefore, I wanted just to give the context here in this session from a clinical trials perspective and clinical development perspective, how data is acquired. So in the clinical trial context, we have a screening phase where patients are included in clinical trials at the sites, and patients are asked to sign informed consent about the procedures of the trial. And if the consent is signed, the procedures and the visits for the patient starts, so that the data is entered in case report forms at the sites, and also trial samples are taken. This could be also not only biosamples, but also digital samples like speech or data from such devices. And these data is then analyzed in order to get outcome, so results, lab results, and all this data is then stored in a clinical trial database. It's quality checked. Data engineers checked all the time that the quality is right of the data, and at a certain point in time, the data is locked, and the analysis of the clinical trials are performed, so that the clinical trial report can be written. On the other hand, we need measurements within trials, and if such a device, for example, is a measurement for a clinical trial, this needs to be established. We would call this digital biomarker, and this digital biomarker undergoes also validation, qualification, so that it can be utilized, for example, to stratify patients within clinical trials. This is all governed by regulation, so how this needs to be performed, for what purposes this data and this biomarker can be utilized. The clinical trial report and also other trials are going into a submission package, and hopefully this submission package is then submitted to authority and an approved product comes out. So the treatment of the patient. This takes around 9 years in research, and then around 6 years to create that product. So it's really a long time with a lot of data that is being generated, and also personal data and sensitive health data that is being generated. On the other hand, we have also the option to take biosamples and also other samples for long-term storage and reuse, so that it's not the purpose is the clinical trial, but also further research. Very basically, a very important concept is the pseudonymization. So we don't have the clear names of the patients at the sponsor sites. We do all the analysis in a coded way. It's pseudonymized data, and the health records stay at the clinical site, and the study sponsor also only has the coded data. The enrollment log is kept at the site for around 25 years, according to local law, and then it's deleted. So to enable all this, we need a quality framework, which needs to be established. So we have well-defined processes. We take care of data integrity. So all data must be attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, accurate, available, consistent, enduring, and complete. So there must be always a custodian of the data. There must be clear purpose for what the data is stored, retention policies, and all that. And we process the data in validated systems. So all the systems that support the clinical development process are qualified and validated. The data, all the data security aspects are built in the systems so that it's secure. On the other hand, we have to validate the systems. We have a risk-based approach so that we do these things appropriately, which is also important, not overdo the things. And now it comes to the use of the data, so the reuse of the data. And as you can imagine, over the last 30 years, a lot of data has been accumulated. We need to make it findable within the company. So therefore, we need to inventorize the data. We need to see what data is in which systems, what has been the purpose of the data. We need to bring it into a catalog so that we can reuse it, to know what we have, and to use the same terms, the same concepts, to name things, which is not always easy. We need metadata also for archiving. So we have regulatory purposes. We need to archive the data. On the other hand, we want to do warehousing of the data. We want to reuse the data. To make this interoperable, since this is research data, studies are very specific research questions, endpoints in the clinical trial with specific patients, in a specific setting, in specific visits. This is very individual but very high value data for this disease, for example, for this patient population. Therefore, we need to look more into how to describe the data in a way that it can be utilized. And the data governance is the part where we need to have an overview about the data. We need to have an understanding of the legal and data protection aspects, how to utilize and enable reuse, and also the risk considerations. So what is, if we utilize the data for purposes that are maybe not ethically aligned, or within the company we develop, certain data scientists have good ideas but are not aligned within the company. So that's things we need to take care of. And last but not least, the approaches for legal basis. I think this is also important here in this conference, and therefore I'm looking forward to discussions also. We have this main consent where the purpose is clear, and here, for example, we have a study where we develop a software application for speech analysis in patients with Alzheimer to predict Alzheimer, for example, to recognize speech, the different aspects of the speech. And this is a non-invasive biomarker, therefore it's high value also for the patients. And to predict this would be also meaning that we can early on treat it and maybe prepare for the disease, which is an important aspect. This is a very clear setting. We would build the trial accordingly to establish the method and the software application. Therefore, it can be stated in the protocol. We have also the other type of consent, which is an optional consent for purposes defined then further on in reusing the data. So when we reuse the data, we define a purpose, and then we look for the consent which is broad. It's unspecified from the patients given. And here, as said, the metadata is very important because we take the data out of the context of the trial into a new context. Is the quality right? Is the appropriate data? And this is in the area of health data. I think the most important aspect is this really good data fit for the purpose of the way it should be used. Then the research privilege. We know GDPR. There we can utilize research privilege, but as we also have in this conference the topic of how ethical committees need to be involved in such kind of a legal basis. Therefore, I think this needs to be established. In the domain, this is not yet established. In the clinical trials domain, ethical committees are very established, are always involved in these clinical trials, but not regarding the reuse of data, where we utilize a different legal basis. This is something which needs to happen. And then the anonymization, which for us, we have the experience in the company anonymizing data, and we went away because we saw it's not compliant with good clinical practice. We always need to go back to we need to be able to go back to the individual subject. Therefore, we cannot utilize this for submission purposes, but for exploratory purpose, we can. But it's difficult to establish within the company. So anonymization within the company to have a clear separation always of the data types, which might not 100% be anonymized, and Max will talk more about that, is an important aspect. And that's all from my side.
Thank you, Martin, for giving us such an in-depth insights into the clinical trials process. Our third speaker is Elizabeth Steindl. Elizabeth is part of the interdisciplinary research platform, Governance of Digital Practices in Vienna. Her research is really focused on mental health, and she works specifically in the space of data protection and privacy aspects that have to do with healthcare governance.
Thank you very much, Timo, for the floor. The topic or the title of the presentation now is How to Govern Digital Practices in Mental Health. Whereas in the first presentation, we heard my colleague Richard talking about the interplay between the Medical Devices Regulation and the AI Act, in particular at the intersection between consumer health devices and medical devices. I'd like to zoom in here a little closer in the field of mental health. Now, the situation that we're confronted with in the space of mental health, especially in the consumer space of mental health, it's just one of many reports that I'm quoting here. It was a report by Mozilla researchers that came out and was circulated at the beginning of May, only a few weeks ago, and proving once again, coming to the result once again, that the practice of data protection and privacy in that space is, quote, spectacularly bad. And I'm quoting from the report, mental health apps are worse than any other product category Mozilla researchers have reviewed over the past 6 years. These apps routinely share data, allow weak passwords, target vulnerable users with personalized ads, and feature vague and poorly written privacy policies. Now, to understand a little better the legal framework that we are operating in, I'd like to build up on the example that we heard in the second presentation by my colleague Martin, that Alzheimer prediction app. Let's assume for a moment that this algorithm is finally developed and before bringing it to the market, let's assume I were the manufacturer who would like to bring it on the market. Now, if I were to bring it on the market, on the medical market, that means that I have to give an intended purpose, which is a medical one. If the app is called Alzheimer Prediction App, it would be a diagnostic one. So yes, it would qualify. It would be meant for interaction with natural persons. So we don't talk about anonymized data here, such as Max will talk later on about. But we're talking about personal data here. We would therefore be governed by GDPR. We would be qualified as medical device, in that case as risk class 2A medical device, which is different to the directive that was before in place, where mental health apps usually were classified risk class 1, and obviously the higher the risk class, the higher the requirements are. In our case, risk class 2A means a rather strict legal regime, actually, conformity assessment by a third party, by a notified body, proof of clinical evidence, certified quality management system, and so on and so on. It also means, and we heard that in the first presentation, that automatically we would be qualified as a high-risk system, due to the fact that it's a medical device and third-party assessment, automatically meaning by Article 6 of the Draft AI Act, which again triggers another list of legal regimes, including another conformity assessment building up on the one that we had to do for the medical devices. We would have to go through human oversight, proving high quality of data sets, logging of activity, clear information to the user, and so on. So another long list of requirements that me as a manufacturer would have to fulfill and go through. Which from a consumer's perspective is awesome. This is the best you can get. This is gold standard. This is the best the law can protect you currently with the prevailing framework. From a manufacturer's point of view, this all sounds actually quite cumbersome and expensive and time-consuming. So why not simply bring the app to the market and go for the consumer health market, which means that instead of giving an intended purpose, which is medical, we would not call that app Alzheimer prediction app. We would call it something like memory and mood tracker, for example, and say the intended purpose is, of course, a well-being one, which means we would still be governed by the GDPR, but never mind, we get rid of the medical devices regulation because we are not within the scope of the medical devices regulation due to recital 19, which explicitly excludes wellness apps. And due to that and the interaction of the Draft AI Act, we would, of course, not be automatically considered a high risk. At best, most likely, we would be considered a medium risk, which implies that the consumer who downloads the app, and I remind you, it's a mood and memory tracker, is informed that the AI system is doing what it's supposed to do, inferring your emotions. No other requirements implied. It's just a transparency obligation that comes with a medium risk category. No rights for the consumers, no obligations for the manufacturers, no obligations for any potential deployer. That's it. From a manufacturer point of view, that sounds actually awesome. But from a consumer point of view, this is not so much what we want, because we end up, if we look at the three legal pieces that primarily govern that consumer mental health space, we end up with a Draft AI Act that doesn't provide significant protection for us. We end up with a medical device regulation that we are beyond the scope of the medical devices regulation, so of course it does not give us any protection. We end up with the GDPR still in place, and we end up, at the first slide that I showed you, with privacy policies that are vague, that are incomprehensible, that are changing over time. We end up with a common practice of data sharing with third parties in that space that is known and that has been studied, and we end up with reportedly less than 30% of the available solutions that are safe and effective. And that meets a market, and that is perhaps different to many of the other fitness apps that are around, that meets a market, the consumer mental health market, which is characterized by vulnerable users, by data that is very intimate, and that has a potential stigmatizing effect, and a huge lack of orientation for consumers and mental health professionals. If you recall, if only 30% of the apps that are on the market in that space are safe and effective, how should a consumer who is already in a vulnerable mental condition find out which one is actually the one to trust? The question, therefore, is what would the policy options for responsible data protection and privacy be in that space, in the consumer mental health market? And since we are actually, although we are talking about regulating AI in mental health innovation here in this panel, but the AI Act doesn't provide us with a significant amount of protection. We are actually back with good old GDPR, also with its enforcement issues that we are well aware about. But if the problem, in brackets, is there, perhaps the solution, or one potential solution is there too. The GDPR does not only provide privacy policies that you have to comply with, but also soft regulation instruments that we can lean back on. It has been discussed in the literature that a code of conduct might be a way to go. I instead would propose here actually a data protection certificate scheme that would be more adequate, more appropriate in this case, because it is, first of all, it's meant to improve the general standards, which in this space, as we've seen in the beginning, is appallingly bad, spectacularly bad. It would strengthen the enforcement of the GDPR, which we've seen in the previous slides is something we actually need there. It would demonstrate compliance and transparency with the GDPR, which is something that mental health app consumers would desperately need here. And although it's a self-regulation tool, that is true because it's on a voluntary basis, once you actually start the process and you get certified, it does come with some strings. So it is a soft regulation in the beginning, but then once you are onto it, actually, it's harder than you might think because you have to certify the device, you have to accredit the certifying body, and you even have to have an approval of the regulation to accredit the certifying body. So there are actually all sorts of authorities, national ones, EDPB as well, that kind of oversee and monitor the process. And it can also be withdrawn, as we know, and it needs to be withdrawn if the device is not compliant anymore. But most importantly, and different to the code of conduct, it's actually addressed, the certification scheme is actually addressed at the data subject. If you go to recital 100, it explicitly states it should allow the data subject to quickly assess the level of data protection in a product and service. So it can actually provide an easier orientation to consumers and mental health experts and professionals, which is desperately needed in that space. It is already, as an instrument, well established in the consumer space because we all know sorts of certification schemes. So it is accepted, it's well known, it's established. And on top of that, it could mean a competitive advantage for companies in a space where trust is a currency. And finally, and these are actually the final remarks, it could close the gap that we've seen, that I've tried to illustrate before, that rigorous gap between the rigorous regulation of medical devices on the one hand and the rather lax or weak regulation in the consumer mental health space. And this is a distinction that we're going to stay with, that is going to remain with us. We've seen it in the legislations that I went through. We are going to see it in the European health data space that we hear about later on. That distinction is going to stay there. So either we operate within it and try to find some fixes and some solutions, and this would be, of course, I think, one of them. With that, thank you for the attention, and I'll hand over to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. So our next speaker is Max Koninsender. He is an associate at a Swiss-based law firm, MLL, where he provides legal advice in the areas of ICT, life sciences, and crypto.
Hello, everyone. As Martin mentioned before, the secondary use of health data especially is not always easy for researchers and innovators, even with tools like the research privilege. One alternative could be anonymization. However, this should not mean that anonymization leads to the possibility to do everything with the data. For example, a recent case in connection with mental health from the UK showed that there was a lot of a PR crisis because mental health helpline anonymized data and used it for other purposes, for research purposes, and this caused a health crisis. So there's always this ethical evaluation too. Yes. One second. Yes. In the legal field, there's always a lot of dispute what anonymization is and if it even works. Some claim that it doesn't work, even though lawmakers still include it in their laws. For example, in the proposal for the regulation of the European health data space, anonymization is mentioned 17 times. The European health data space talks about anonymization as a technique to reduce privacy risks for individuals. But what is anonymization and how does it work? The main objective of this presentation is not only to show what anonymization could mean or means, but also to suggest a risk-based approach on how to implement anonymization, for example, in a research project, and always keeping in mind the risk of re-identification and trying to mitigate it. As most of you probably know, recital 26 of the GDPR says that the GDPR does not apply for data, for information that does not relate or is not relatable to an identified or identifiable person. In the 2014 opinion of the Working Party 29, anonymization is defined as a technique applied to personal data in order to achieve irreversible de-identification. As many researchers have shown, it's almost impossible to achieve irreversibility, even in highly complex data sets where many indicators are struck. It was possible to re-identify the natural persons. And in the 2007 opinion of the Working Party 29, they took a more realistic approach towards anonymization. They say that a mere hypothetical possibility to single out an individual is not enough to consider the person as identifiable. Yes, and there should be reasonably likely means considered, which are dependent on objective factors, such as the cost and the amount of time required, and also the available technology. In this aspect, it's also really important that anonymization is not a task that can be done at one moment and can be considered to be anonymized forever. There has to be regular re-evaluation of the anonymization. The next point is whether there's a relative or absolute perspective. This is disputed. In a relative perspective, we take the position from the controller or from the person having access to the data, and looking if this person is able to identify the natural person with reasonably likely means. From the absolute perspective, we say that if someone can re-identify the person, the data is not anonymized. In the case Breyer from the European Court of Justice, they indicated a relative approach. Yes, and there's also a knowledge attribution between joint controllers and controller processor, or possibly from other parties. So additional information that can be used has also be attributed to the controller. So the key evaluations are that anonymization is not an easy escape from regulation, that anonymization requires a continuous reassessment of the risk of re-identification and the robustness of the anonymization technique, and that the risk of re-identification should always be acknowledged and mitigated. In the Pro-Cancer Eye project, which is a Horizon 2020 project funded by the European Union, we worked together on a cancer research project, and we developed an approach on how to anonymize data and keeping in mind the risk. I worked on this approach together with my colleagues Emily Johnson and Teresa Henn. Yes. The first step of this approach is that there's no one-fits-all approach. Of course, the anonymization tool has to be robust and continuously tested. In the ProCancer project, we worked with DICOM files, which are medical imaging files containing the medical image on the one side and metadata, which also includes personal identifiers. In the first step, there was a local blacklisting done, where the identifiers were deleted. And in the second step, in the second stage of this process, this was controlled, whether this was done correctly, and additional identifiers were struck. The most important point, in my opinion, is the assessment and testing. So the robustness of the anonymization technique has to be tested, and whether it's reasonably impossible to identify the natural person. Potential risk factors could be the singling out, linkability, and inference. And always important that this is regularly re-evaluated. Yes, the removal of links is really important. Some claim that data can only be truly anonymized if the original data set is deleted. This is highly unlikely that this will happen, for example, in a clinical environment where this data, for example, has to be contained for legal reasons also. Other techniques, instead of the deletion of the original data set, would be randomization, generalization, or masking. Taking a relative approach, there are also questions if there's reference data needed. For example, the medical image, the original medical image, if there are even lawful or factual possibilities of the controller of the anonymized data set to gain access to this reference data. Yes, a really important point is that even the anonymized data should be treated as its personal data within this research consortium. So access management methods have to be implemented. And only the users that specifically need the access to the data should be granted access. Last but not least, of course, IT security measures should be taken, appropriate ones. For example, in cloud environments, there are often high IT security standards because the cloud providers put a lot of resources into the cybersecurity. But one problem is that often when the data is in use is decrypted by the cloud processor. A possible solution for this would be confidential computing, where within a trusted execution environment, the data can also be encrypted while in use. Last but not least, these steps should be the steps presented should be contractually agreed upon within the research consortium, that everyone knows what should be done and what should be considered. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Max. Anonymization is something that okay, clap. I was just going to say, anonymization is something that we researchers are constantly battling with, so thank you, Max, for the in-depth presentation. So we're almost at the end of our panel, so everyone, please stay with us. Our final panelist is Mariana Rossetto. She is a research associate at the University of Vienna, and she works on various EU-funded technology projects, providing her expertise in the area of data protection.
Thank you very much, Tima, for the floor. Thank you very much for the audience. So being the last here of the panelists of this panel, I want actually to bring one topic that interlinks with, I think, many of the presentations that we have heard before, starting with Richard's IoT devices and the interplay with between the medical device regulation and the AI Act proposal, also to Martin's use case sample, which I would actually have also a similar use case to to prove actually the interlink and the considerations between the two proposals that you can see here on the screen, to pseudonymization and wellness application. But what is this presentation going to be about? And this is basically some preliminary thoughts that, on the interplay between these two proposals that appear on the screen, between the European Health Data Space Regulation, recently published, I think is exactly 20 days ago, by the European Commission, and the Artificial Intelligence Act proposal having the consideration of the compromise text in November 2021. By using this and the preliminary considerations, I wanted to look into the research aspect of doing this interplay by using a use case. But first, what I wanted to perhaps point out is one of the main goals of the European health data space as having to provide access to health data or health data sets, which are, let's say, necessary to make successful, the use of artificial intelligence to drive research in healthcare. And this connection, and this is something, this was one of the aims that was brought already in the assessment on member states' rules on the use on health data in the light of the GDPR already in 2019. So this statement is already reflected from that day on to the proposal today, as of course the proposal builds up on different enforced regulations, as we all know, GDPR, to of course different European Commission proposals like the Artificial Intelligence Act, and perhaps just as a side note, the regulation does not state in the operative part that the per se is built, this regulation is built on and is without prejudice to other union law acts. This is only stated in the descriptive part of the Commission. So here we start, let's say, the first consideration on my side is how strong this interplay is going to be. As I was saying, I wanted to just present one use case, thinking what would happen if a project, and I clarify this, what the project is about, would happen if such a project would like to avail from electronic health data, let's say, made available within the space in order to train the algorithms. Just starting from the start, sorry, that's redundant. What the project is about, and I took this project for two reasons. The first one because I'm involved in, and the second one is because the use case used by the Commission to exemplify the benefits of this space is actually mirrors this project that was already started in 2018. So basically what the project is about, just a few words. The project is aims to establish a cloud-based infrastructure for the processing of health data with a specific AI module for neurodegenerative diseases, specific Alzheimer's. So here, again, the connection with the speech recognition app mentioned by Martin, based on MRI scans. So basically based on imaging scans. As you all know, what the challenges are, let's say, were and are still for this project, I think that most of you in the audience can say availability of health data, so legal and administrative, of course, hindrances in order to actually grasp the data and train these algorithms. With pseudonymized data and non-anonymized data. And the second one was the interoperability of health data, meaning already the project stated that one of the, let's say, main challenges for performing and training the algorithm and to grasp, of course, the data was that they have spent more time in trying to bring the data into the FAIR principles, as this is a Horizon 2020 project, a part of the obligations of the project per se, than actually performing the data. And this is confirmed by a recently published article in Nature journal, which exactly confirms this. So this comes again to the question that I would like to repeat: what if such a project wants to avail itself, or the AI developers from the data held by triggering the health European health data space process, and how, in order specifically to train, test, and validate the system. So the first consideration that I wanted to bring to this room was, under the proposal, there is of course stated there is a need, or is a purpose, or sorry, there is an intended purpose that needs to be complied with under Article 32 to allow the data requesters for the secondary use of health data. Here we see a great parallelism, and specifically if we're thinking about this project of training, testing, and evaluating algorithms, that would fit actually the purpose for this. Another consideration that I have, sub-consideration with this, is that whether actually the wording of Article 35G specifically, which is training, testing, and evaluating algorithms, actually interplays with the wording that is stated in article as one of the obligations, and I'm going to get there, for high-risk AI systems developers under Article 10 on data and data governance, where it's always stated on one different word, which is training where evaluating instead of validating. And this, for me, could also pose an interpretive issue. When we think about, once we have, of course, this purpose and intended purpose kind of achieved, the interplay with the AI Act specifically comes relevant for those systems that are categorized under high-risk AI systems. What happens with research projects, or actually AI systems which are developed for the sole purpose of research and placed to market in that purpose? And this is actually these high-risk AI systems actually fall outside the scope of the AI Act, which of course will hinder us then the interplay with the European health data space. The second issue that I wanted to bring is regarding the categorization. So I said that we need this interplay to materialize. That is, this system is categorized as high-risk AI. And this generates this interlink, and I call them kind of tripartite cross obligations, as if we need to categorize the system as a high-risk AI. So the AI Act we apply, the obligations arising from the European health data space also we apply if considered to be, and that's the next point, electronic health record system, plus the medical device regulation would also might apply according to whether we assess that the software could actually fit for the purpose as Richard explained. And if in the case high risk, the system within the project could actually be qualified as high risk AI, one of the obligations that are stated by the AI Act, or deriving, from the Act, is the data and data governance, which I wanted to pay special attention because of the question whether it could actually it could actually be sorry, I lost my thread to be honest. Whether actually would it make sense, to put it like very simple, would make sense to let's say go through the process for, let's say, the application process and the use of the data sets made available within the space in order to comply with this particular obligation. And this is the question, that I have as the first point is regarding the availability of data, since Article 10.2 requires a prior assessment of the suitability of the data sets that are needed in order to consider the data set, the training, testing, and validation, and testing of data sets of a quality, as is described in the article. And additionally, Article 10.4 states that these datasets shall take into account the characteristics or elements that are particular to a specific behavior or functional setting. So I'm considering these two, let's say, sub-obligations from Article 10. For me, it's open, and whether this can clash with the current proposal and the availability of data that would be within, let's say, made available within the data space, as the Commission is only tasked to make a list of data types that are available within the space, but does not provide the elements of what data sets, what actually the data sets would contain, and which might make difficult for the AI developer to then comply and perform this suitability assessment on the data sets. And I think this idea with the purpose of fit for use was also mentioned by Martin, right? Specifically when it comes to health. The next point is regarding the data quality and the definitions, or the ideas that we have from data quality within the AI Act and the European Health Data Space proposal, and as quality in terms of data sets in the AI Act are specifically referred to as a process to comply with certain elements in Article 10, and in the European Health Data Space, this specific data quality is defined as related to, and I'm quoting here, as to the degree to which characteristics of electronic health data sets are suitable for secondary use. So bringing, of course, this example, we might not be fully compatible on what we understand on data quality. And last but not least, I had recital 45 of the AI Act, AI Act is there, makes, under my consideration, a wishful thinking of providing, for example, AI developers that should have, access to certain and high-quality data sets. And my question is, this is only in the recital part, not the operative part, so there is no obligation per se within the AI Act to use data sets within the space, only this is mentioned in the recital. And again, I mean, this might, of course, this actually, will put of course, this risk of fragmentation of what kind of quality data sets we are, AI developers avail to train, test, and validate their systems. I think in a matter of time, I just make very few conclusions regarding the interplay between the AI Act and the European Health Data Space proposal, which are basically, this interplay is only actually, from my perspective, mirrored in if the systems are qualified and high-risk AI systems. We'll still have the issue with availability of data that I already mentioned at the beginning as one of the challenges of the project. And we also have a data quality terminology issue that needs to be solved in order to guarantee, let's say, the high-quality testing data sets for AI systems. Thank you, and I'm very happy if I receive questions.
Thank you to all of our panelists for the informative and compelling presentations. Just because we have about 10 minutes left, I would like to open the floor for questions. If you have any questions for our panelists, you can. Okay, yeah, we'll start with you over there. You can take the mic, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Really, really interesting on all the topics that you touched. I was wondering whether the use of synthetic data could be a further option in terms of anonymization, using AI to anonymize and not using data for the AI. So thank you.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Of course, synthetic data is a can be a good alternative in some ways. Of course, it has to be considered that the processing or the synthesizing of the data is also data processing and needs a legal basis, but it can be a great alternative. But what was also a reason for this presentation was I was wondering why among a lot of legal scholars there's always this uncertainty about anonymization, but even considering this, the lawmaker keeps on mentioning anonymization as a technique which is feasible. For example, in the European health data space, one has to explain why when he wants access to pseudonymized data, why he why anonymized data is not enough. And this is a little bit of a contradiction. If for example, in the Working Party 29 opinion from 2014, according to this opinion, it's almost impossible to achieve true anonymization, and still the lawmaker is always talking about it. So yes, I think synthetic data can be in a lot of use cases a great alternative, but yes, this was not the main objective of this presentation, but I think it can be a great alternative.
All right, thank you, Max. We had a question over here in the front. Oh, maybe we can start with the lady at the back.
Lady at the back? Yeah, you are.
Hi, my question is for Martin. My name is Kira Staunton. I'm a researcher at a biobank in northern Italy. And so a lot of the issues that we're facing, similar to what you spoke about. I think the point you made on metadata and the context is incredibly important. It's something in the research context that is always overlooked. But I had two questions I want to ask you. First, you use broad consent in the research context, but I just want to know how broad is the broad consent? Is it for all research? And also, how do you decide on reuse? Is there an internal access group? Is it independent, or is it all done internally? And do you ever share outside of the company, or is it only for internal use?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So the metadata, as you said, is essential in all of that. The use of the consent itself, so for primary use, for the use within the clinical trial is clear, so the protocol is clear. And for the broader consent, we tackle medical research. So we are in the space of we need to develop further therapeutic products. We need to understand the disease, and that's the focus we have. And that's what we try to explain in that consent to the patients.
And it's all internal use, you never share externally?
We share externally also, and we do anonymization with Transcelerate consortia, where we have also contracts. So there are measures in place. But very seldomly we do complete anonymization. So only with specific, for example, images where we can say this is completely anonymized in a way, but that's very seldom. Mm-hmm.
All right, thank you, Martin. And we'll take the last two questions here in the front. Start with him.
Thank you. I'm Marco Flora from University of Groningen. I'm a PhD researcher. And my question is also related to consent. So we're talking a lot about reuse of personal data, and my question would be if you consider that there are cases when you need reconsent for such use. Are you implementing this? And what do you think about the idea of dynamic consent, meaning that you can visualize the preferences and then withdraw and maybe expand the initially expressed choices? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So the reconsent is usually done within the trial. So you can reconsent if there is amendments to the protocol. You can reconsent. But usually if you have a finalized clinical trial, the effort to reconsent is very high. And therefore we are not doing this for the purposes of reuse of data so far. And the second question was?
Dynamic consent.
This would be, so in my opinion, something like that would be very appropriate, because having an overview about the data that I have maybe in the space, and being able to see and to consent, to review my consent regularly is something important. Mm-hmm.
Okay, last question.
Thank you for the excellent presentation. I am Marvin van Bekker from the Radboud University, and I'm both a computer scientist and a lawyer. And I was wondering, from a technical perspective, anonymization is a scale rather than an absolute. So there is a degree to which you can say two things within a system are linkable and identifiable. And my question is, do you think that the legal definition of anonymization should match the technical reality in the first place? Or if you think that it should be a holy grail that can never be achieved, like the GDPR seems right now.
Yeah, I think it should, of course, match the technical reality, and I think this is also reflected quite well in the 2007 opinion of the Working Party 29, which I mentioned, where this is reasonably likely or unlikely that the data is or the person is re-identified with reasonably likely means, just as the cost and the time needed. And I also think that it's disputed about, but this relative approach also makes sense, because if the absolute approach, it can always be possible that someone in the world can identify this data set. But for example, if you don't get access to this data set or to the reference data, for example, if you cannot compare two medical images because the clinical institution is bound also by professional secrecy and so on, it doesn't make any sense to take this absolute approach, in my opinion. So I think, of course, it should be intact with the technical reality. Yeah.
All right, thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Okay, I have a question. My question would be for Marianne. The European Health Data Space adopts a permit-based approach, and a lot of people have been quite critical of this approach, stating that it puts in place another sort of gatekeeper and kind of makes it onerous, and people suggest that the best approach, if we're looking at innovation in the area of digital health, would be to adopt more of what the GDPR proposes as a risk-based approach. So what do you think about this criticism, and do you think that this is something that should be changed?
Thank you, Tima, for the question. I would say, I mean, there are two coins, let's say two parts of the coin to this question. And I would say first, yes, I understand the criticism regarding that could actually turn into a very, very cumbersome process to access data, specifically if you need an immediate, let's say, a grasp of such data for performing any other reasons under Article 34. And which actually would add to this, let's say, cumbersome, is because, for example, the time, like the 2 months time that the data holder has to comply with in order to release such data. Yeah. And this is, for many purposes, quite late, plus the authority, the National Health Data Access Body, has, if I'm not wrong, also 2 months to consider to issue the data permit, which of course then we are talking to a framework at least of 4 months in total, or if not more, would perhaps make many of the purposes for the secondary use completely rentless.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. And thank you to you all for joining us this morning.
About 6 minutes, so you can continue.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Any more questions, perhaps? Yes,
one
great. We have one over there.
Thank you. First of all, I'm a data protection lawyer. I'm working for a life science company. And lately, I'm seeing that a lot of sponsors having that. Maybe I can come like this. Taking advantage of this mental health apps, and they are taking a lot of data from there. And as a lawyer, I'm having a lot of trouble allocation of responsibilities, because first of all, we think that sponsors are the controller, basically. But in this position, also that is mental health apps taking a lot of data from this, and these sponsors are using their data. And I'm having a lot of trouble how to describe their responsibilities here and how to allocate, and which one is the controller, which one is the processor.
I'm having a lot of trouble about that. What do you think about these mental health apps and sponsors mostly?
Well, as we've seen, as has been described in a number of studies, that space is really, it's been called also the Wild West of apps, and it's even worse than in comparable fitness apps. So even if we do have clear responsibilities, or even if we have, for example, a clear legitimate grounds to share data, such as for research purposes, as we've seen before in that UK, I'm sure you heard about the case in the UK, where they shared legitimately, presumably legitimately, the data for research purposes with a British university even, I can't remember which one exactly that was, and a comparable, not exactly comparable, but somehow to a certain extent a comparable case in the US where a suicide hotline shared data. It was on legitimate grounds, but still there's that ethical aspect, and there's still, even if you can do it, so regardless whether you're the controller or the processor of simply the processor of the data, even if you're legitimately allowed, you should think twice or 3 times or even 10 times, because the data that is being shared there, contrary to other apps that perhaps are measuring my cholesterol level, which I agree is still very personal, and I still agree with possibly you that it's of no one's business than of mine, but it doesn't affect my relationships with other people. It doesn't affect my potentially my career if data is shared on that. It does not destroy the trust in an entire therapy, for example, which is very specific and particular for the mental health space. So my answer would be, regardless actually how the simple legal responsibilities are distributed, you should think 3 times about the ethical implications of what you're doing and why you're actually doing what you're doing, sharing the data, and perhaps abstain from that. Yeah, you're welcome.
All right, any more questions? Okay, I have a question for Richard. So Richard, you mentioned, I think it was in your last slide, about the barrier that the AI Act imposes on small to medium-sized companies and startups. How would you say that we could tackle this in the proposal, or what would your suggestions be for regulators on how to kind of mitigate this?
Well, thank you, Timo, for the question. According to the impact assessment study prepared for the AI Act and some other relevant studies prepared by stakeholders, the compliance costs of in the healthcare industry will increase by about 15,000 euros for an AI project. This could have several implications. First of all, it might price out increased compliance costs significantly for startup companies in the field, so they will choose methods that are not based on AI systems.
Yeah.
Then there's also another consideration that since the European Union and member states are supporting AI to such an extent, actually there might be providers or manufacturers who will opt to choose AI systems even when it would be actually cheaper or make more sense from a technical point of view to use a non-AI method. So whatever this over-regulation definitely will have will distort the market in some aspect, and perhaps what generally the healthcare industry has called for the exemption of AI-enabled medical devices from the Draft AI Act, and that AI specificities for medical devices should be detailed either in the medical devices regulation or by the medical devices coordination group in its guidelines in order to decrease this amount of over-regulation that might be imposed on the industry and hinder innovation.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. And thank you again to all of you for joining, and we look forward to getting to know you during the rest of the conference. Can we have a round of applause for our panelists?